Behind the polished logos, sleek advertisements, and multi-million-dollar profits, the corporate world hides a darker side. A side driven by greed, power, and deception. You've heard of big scandals like Enron, Volkswagen, and the 2008 financial crisis, but have you ever wondered what drives these massive corporate failures? How do companies that seem untouchable suddenly come crashing down? What makes these organizations so vulnerable to corruption and fraud? And why does it keep happening, despite the massive damage it causes to everyday people? Today, we're peeling back the curtain to expose the dark economy that fuels these corporate scandals. Trust me, what you'll uncover will shock you. What looks like just another headline on the news is much more than that. It's a systemic problem, embedded deep within our economy. In the next hour, we'll take you through some of the most infamous corporate scandals that shook the world to its core. We'll show you how these companies were able to thrive in secrecy for so long, with billions of dollars at stake. We'll break down the economics behind these events and why they're not isolated incidents but part of a much bigger dark economy. From fraudulent accounting practices that go unnoticed for years to environmental disasters that were swept under the rug, we'll reveal how corporate greed, lack of oversight, and systemic flaws fuel these scandals. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand the scandals themselves but also what they reveal about the very structure of our economy and the systems that allow these types of abuses to thrive unchecked. So, what exactly are corporate scandals? These are not just about one or two bad decisions. They represent deeper problems within the corporate structure. A culture of greed, lack of accountability, and a failure to act in the public's best interest. It's a mindset that breeds dishonesty and manipulation, and it permeates every level of the company, from top executives to middle management. It's not just about bad apples in the corporate world, it's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. These scandals often start small but quickly snowball, becoming massive operations built on fraud. They thrive on the illusion of success. The bigger the lie, the easier it is to believe. And when the truth eventually comes out, it's often too late. Billions of dollars are lost, and lives are ruined. Companies collapse, but the effects ripple out, touching investors, employees, and the public in devastating ways. Over the next few sections, we'll explore some of the biggest scandals in history, companies that seemed untouchable but were brought down by their own actions. We'll look at the tactics used to perpetuate the fraud, how they operated, and why these companies got away with it for so long. As we move forward, we'll break down some of the most infamous corporate scandals. But it's not just about the drama. We're going to dive into the underlying economy that makes these kinds of frauds possible and look at the gaping holes in our system that allow corporate criminals to thrive. And most importantly, we'll see what can be done to stop this from happening again. So, stay with us. In the next segment, we'll explore the culture that enables these frauds and how corporations can build empires on lies before they eventually come crashing down. The corporate world is often seen as a place of innovation, a place where cutting-edge ideas thrive, and successful companies create wealth for their shareholders. But what lies beneath the surface? Beneath the sleek advertisements and polished logos, there's a dark side, a side driven by deception, manipulation, and greed. How do these companies operate with such apparent immunity? Why do they continue to engage in fraudulent behavior, even when the risks of getting caught are so high? The reality is, many corporations prioritize profits over people. And in such an environment, ethics are often the first casualty. The mantra becomes clear: maximizing profit at any cost, even if it means bending the rules, lying to investors, or harming the environment. These companies justify their actions by focusing on short-term gains, ignoring the long-term consequences. But the question remains, how does this culture of deception become normalized? Let's dive deeper into the corporate culture that allows this kind of behavior. In the pursuit of success, companies are often structured to reward profits above all else. The obsession with meeting quarterly targets, the pressure to deliver returns to investors, and the fear of losing market share all create a perfect storm for unethical practices. Executives feel an overwhelming pressure to deliver. They are expected to provide unrealistic growth figures year after year. This pressure, combined with the desire to secure massive bonuses and promotions, leads them to make choices that push the boundaries of what's ethical or legal. In this kind of environment, executives are encouraged or even rewarded for their ability to manipulate financial statements, hide liabilities, and present an image of success, regardless of the actual numbers. Financial fraud becomes a tool used to meet the expectations of investors, who only care about one thing, the bottom line. Think about it, if the reward for success is massive profits and huge bonuses, and the consequences for failure are swept under the rug, the incentive to cheat becomes too tempting for many. And when failure eventually catches up, the company can just go through a bailout or file for bankruptcy, leaving everyday people, employees, customers, investors, holding the bag. But it doesn't stop at just manipulating financial statements. In fact, some companies will go to extreme lengths to cover up environmental harm, unethical labor practices, and other illegal activities to keep the illusion of success intact. Companies like Volkswagen with their emission test rigging, or Enron with their accounting schemes, are prime examples of how far some executives will go to protect their bonuses and their company's reputation. In many cases, the perverse incentives don't just lead to fraudulent behavior, they actively encourage it. In a culture that celebrates quick profits and instant success, ethics take a back seat. The corporate world becomes a place where lying, cheating, and even breaking the law become acceptable, as long as it leads to higher returns. The financial success of a company becomes more important than the long-term health of the company, the environment, or the well-being of its people. In fact, some executives are directly incentivized to take massive risks and engage in unethical behavior. By inflating stock prices, manipulating earnings, or even hiding scandals, these executives ensure that the company looks more profitable than it is, at least for a time. And when they eventually get caught, they often walk away with golden parachutes, huge severance packages, while the people they've harmed are left with nothing. Money, at the end of the day, is the lifeblood of the corporate world. But when left unchecked, it becomes a source of corruption, exploitation, and manipulation. Corporate executives have a responsibility to act in the best interest of shareholders and employees, but when profit becomes the primary driver, that responsibility goes out the window. Let's take a look at a few examples of how unregulated pursuit of profit has led to catastrophic scandals in the past. In the case of Enron, the executives were willing to deceive their employees, manipulate stock prices, and even falsify earnings to present themselves as a growing, profitable company. All this while their employees lost their retirement savings, and the company's stock value crashed, leaving investors empty-handed. In the Volkswagen emissions scandal, top executives prioritized making their cars look eco-friendly to appeal to environmentally conscious consumers, while knowing full well they were deceiving governments and buyers. Their greed led to a toxic corporate culture that ultimately cost them billions in fines and lost trust. But what makes this even more troubling is that these companies had plenty of resources to succeed without resorting to fraud. The obsession with maximizing profits and securing executive bonuses at all costs led to decisions that sacrificed integrity for short-term gain. Let's talk about corporate bonuses for a moment. These bonuses, often tied directly to the company's stock performance, create an environment where executives are incentivized to take excessive risks, mislead investors, and push their companies into ethical gray areas. When executives are rewarded with huge bonuses based on short-term performance metrics, they're not necessarily thinking about the long-term stability of the company or the social good. Instead, they focus on getting the stock price up, even if that means cutting corners, engaging in shady accounting practices, or covering up dangerous problems. For example, during the 2008 financial crisis, banks handed out massive bonuses to executives even while the company was going under. They had sacrificed long-term stability to boost their short-term profits, and as a result, the global economy collapsed. And the truth is, these kinds of corporate scandals aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a bigger, deeper problem in the corporate world. The culture of deception, driven by a hunger for profit, is systemic. But how do we change this? How do we hold corporations accountable for their actions, and stop this cycle of fraud from continuing? Stick with us, because we'll dive into the real-world consequences of these corporate failures and show you exactly how these scandals are tied to the dark economy that continues to thrive in plain sight. But before we get there, let's take a closer look at the role of money in making these scandals possible.
Case Study 1. Enron, the fall of an energy giant. In the late 1990s, Enron was the darling of Wall Street, an energy giant that seemed unstoppable. Its stock prices soared, and its executives were hailed as business geniuses, visionaries who had revolutionized the energy sector. But behind the polished presentations and glitzy Wall Street appearances, the reality was far darker. Enron's impressive rise wasn't fueled by innovation, but by deception and fraud. Once one of the most respected companies in America, Enron's massive fraud would eventually become one of the most notorious corporate scandals in history. But how did they pull it off? How did a company worth billions manipulate the market and deceive investors for so long? Let's take a closer look at how Enron's colossal fraud unfolded. Enron's financial house of cards was built on one simple idea: deceiving the public and hiding debt. They used complex accounting tricks, including special purpose entities, SPEs, to conceal their growing liabilities and inflate profits. This allowed the company to appear as though it was thriving, while in reality, it was living on borrowed time. SPEs are companies set up by Enron that appeared independent from the parent company. The idea was that Enron could keep its debt off its balance sheet by transferring it to these entities. This made Enron's financial situation look much healthier than it really was, allowing them to report massive profits while hiding the crippling debt they were accumulating. Meanwhile, Enron's top executives were working tirelessly to maintain the illusion of success. They paid off Wall Street analysts to give glowing reviews of the company, and they kept investors in the dark about the true nature of their financials. To the public, Enron was a powerhouse, a company that couldn't fail. They were one of the largest energy companies in the world, trading everything from natural gas to electricity, even dabbling in internet services. But as you'll see, this success was entirely manufactured. By the time Wall Street analysts and investors realized what was really happening, it was already too late. Enron's stock was artificially inflated, and once the truth began to surface, the company was doomed. In 2001, everything came crashing down. The once untouchable energy giant had built its empire on lies and fraud, and when the truth came out, it was disastrous. The accounting tricks and hidden debt were exposed, and the public quickly realized that Enron was not the powerhouse it had appeared to be. Employees, many of whom had invested their entire retirement savings in Enron stock, watched in horror as the company collapsed overnight. The company's stock value plummeted, and with it went the life savings of thousands of workers. Investors who had poured money into the company were left holding worthless stock, and many lost billions of dollars. The scandal wasn't just financial, it was personal. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and their pensions. Many had been encouraged by Enron's executives to invest in the company's stock, only to see their investments evaporate. The emotional toll on the victims was immense. They had trusted the company, and their lives were ruined by the actions of those in charge. As the investigation into the company deepened, it became clear that the fraud had been going on for years. Top executives at Enron, including CEO Kenneth Lay, CFO Andrew Fastow, and COO Jeffrey Skilling, had orchestrated the entire scheme. They had knowingly misled investors and regulators, hid debt, and inflated profits to keep the company's stock price high. Once the truth came to light, they were charged with criminal fraud and other offenses. The legal repercussions for Enron's executives were swift. Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey Skilling, and Andrew Fastow were charged with a variety of criminal offenses, including fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Fastow, the company's CFO, was one of the first to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony revealed the true depth of Enron's fraudulent practices and how the company had been able to maintain the illusion of success for so long. In 2006, Skilling was convicted on 19 counts of fraud and conspiracy, and Lay was convicted on 6 counts. Lay died before he could serve his sentence, but Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Fastow was sentenced to 6 years, but served only 4 after cooperating with the investigation. However, these convictions did little to repair the damage caused by Enron's collapse. The damage wasn't just financial. Enron's scandal also caused reputational damage to the broader energy industry, and it led to major reforms in corporate governance. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002 in direct response to the Enron scandal, establishing stricter regulations for financial reporting and corporate accountability. This act aimed to prevent further corporate fraud and protect investors from similar schemes. Enron's collapse had ripple effects throughout the energy sector. As a major player in the market, Enron had huge influence on energy pricing and supply. Their fraudulent reporting had affected energy traders, regulators, and consumers. The scandal shattered trust in energy companies and sparked widespread skepticism about the accuracy of financial reports in the industry. In addition to the immediate financial fallout, Enron's fall also raised questions about the role of corporate executives and accounting firms in overseeing companies. Enron's relationship with its accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, was central to the scandal. Arthur Andersen was found guilty of obstruction of justice for destroying documents related to its audits of Enron's financial records. This led to the collapse of one of the Big Five accounting firms, and many in the industry were left reeling from the fallout. Enron's story wasn't just about the fall of a company, it was a warning to the corporate world. For years, the company's executives managed to stay ahead of the truth. They manipulated the system, took advantage of loopholes, and deceived the public. But in the end, the truth caught up with them. The question is, if Enron's collapse could happen to one of the most successful companies in the world, what does it say about the system we trust with our investments? How many more companies are out there operating with the same deceitful tactics, just waiting for the truth to come crashing down? Case Study 2. Volkswagen, the diesel emissions scandal. Volkswagen, one of the most iconic car manufacturers in the world, was long known for its sleek vehicles and its eco-friendly image. They marketed themselves as a company that was dedicated to sustainability, producing cars that were environmentally responsible and fuel efficient. But behind the glossy advertisements and green initiatives, Volkswagen was hiding a dark secret, a secret that would eventually unravel in one of the most shocking corporate scandals in recent history. In 2015, it was revealed that Volkswagen had been cheating on emissions tests for its diesel vehicles for years. The company had installed defeat devices in their cars to manipulate emissions readings during tests. On the surface, Volkswagen seemed to be making environmentally friendly vehicles, but in reality, their cars were polluting the air far beyond legal limits. The truth was exposed, and the fallout was catastrophic. How did Volkswagen pull off such a massive deception? The answer lies in the clever use of defeat devices. These are devices that were secretly installed in Volkswagen's diesel vehicles, allowing the cars to detect when they were undergoing emissions tests. During the tests, the cars would emit low levels of pollutants to pass the test. But once the test was over and the car returned to regular driving conditions, the defeat devices allowed the cars to release harmful emissions that far exceeded environmental standards. This wasn't just a minor oversight. Volkswagen had intentionally designed and implemented this system to deceive regulators and avoid costly compliance with environmental laws. These cars were not just failing to meet emission standards. They were deliberately polluting the environment while maintaining a clean, eco-friendly image in the eyes of the public. This was a massive betrayal, not only of regulators, but of millions of consumers who had trusted Volkswagen to deliver environmentally responsible vehicles. They were sold the lie that they were driving cars that were better for the planet, only to learn that those cars were contributing to the very pollution they were promised to prevent. But how could a company as large and well-known as Volkswagen engage in such a brazen fraud? The answer lies in its corporate culture, one that placed profits above ethics and maintained a competitive advantage at all costs. Volkswagen had strong incentives to make sure their diesel cars performed well in emissions tests, particularly because diesel engines were marketed as a more fuel-efficient and eco-friendly alternative to gasoline engines. At the top, executives and engineers were under immense pressure to meet regulatory requirements and maintain profitability. Their goal was to develop high-performing, eco-friendly cars without losing market share. But instead of investing in legitimate technology to meet environmental standards, Volkswagen executives decided to cut corners and rely on fraud to keep their cars on the road. The company's leadership actively encouraged employees to engage in unethical behavior. They fostered an environment where greed and profit took precedence over doing the right thing. This culture of deceit was ingrained in the company and allowed the fraud to persist for years without detection. Once the scandal broke, the consequences for Volkswagen were swift and severe. The company faced not just legal battles, but also a massive reputation crisis. The damage wasn't just financial, it was moral. Volkswagen had deceived millions of customers, regulators, and environmental organizations, damaging their public image beyond repair. The legal consequences were significant. Volkswagen was hit with over $25 billion in fines and settlements. This included compensation for customers who had bought vehicles under false pretenses and fines for violating environmental laws. But the financial penalties were just one part of the problem. The fallout extended far beyond the immediate legal consequences. Volkswagen's brand was shattered. Once known as a reliable, eco-conscious car manufacturer, it was now seen as a company that was willing to compromise its values for short-term profit. Consumers lost trust in the brand, and competitors seized the opportunity to highlight Volkswagen's deceitful practices. But it wasn't just the public image that suffered. The company's stock price plummeted, and executives faced criminal charges. Some were convicted and served prison time for their role in orchestrating the fraud. Others resigned, leaving behind a tarnished legacy. The scandal didn't just tarnish Volkswagen's reputation in the short term. It changed the company forever. Even though the company eventually took steps to recover and rebuild its image, the damage was permanent. Volkswagen's betrayal of trust would be remembered as one of the most significant corporate scandals in history, and it serves as a cautionary tale of how a company's greed can lead to devastating consequences. The long-term impact on their reputation was far-reaching. Many consumers who once viewed Volkswagen as a trusted brand now saw them as another example of corporate greed and deceit. While the company worked hard to recover, their efforts couldn't undo the harm done to their relationship with the public. Additionally, the emissions scandal sparked an industry-wide reckoning. Governments around the world began tightening regulations on emissions testing, and automakers were forced to invest in legitimate technology to meet these new standards. But even today, the fallout from the scandal continues to affect the industry as a whole. Volkswagen's scandal was a wake-up call for the corporate world. It exposed how a company could operate with impunity, deceiving the public for years while reaping the rewards of its deceit. The question is, if Volkswagen could get away with this, how many other companies are using similar tactics to deceive regulators and consumers? As we dig deeper into this story, think about the broader implications. How many of the world's biggest corporations are engaging in similar fraudulent practices, and how much longer will we let them get away with it? Case Study 3. The 2008 Financial Crisis. In 2008, the financial world collapsed in what would later be known as the Great Recession. But what caused this massive global downturn? Was it just the economy crashing due to external factors? The truth is, the crisis wasn't just a global downturn. It was a systemic failure fueled by corporate greed, risky lending, and unregulated markets. And the people who paid the highest price for this failure? The everyday citizens. The ones who trusted the system, believed in the stability of banks, and worked hard to achieve the American dream. What we saw in 2008 wasn't just a financial collapse, it was a failure of the entire system. The housing market exploded, banks failed, and entire economies were crippled. But the question remains, what was it that made this crisis so devastating, and who were the real culprits behind it? Let's break it down. It wasn't a random event. The Great Recession was the result of corruption, risky behavior, and the complete breakdown of financial oversight. And at the heart of it all was corporate greed. It all began with subprime mortgages, loans given to high-risk individuals who couldn't afford them. Banks didn't care whether these people could repay their loans. What mattered to them was that they could sell the loans and make a profit. It didn't matter if the borrower had a steady job or the means to repay the loan. The goal was simple: make the loan, sell it, and move on. Banks were lending money to anyone, even people with terrible credit, because they were eager to collect on higher interest rates that came with these high-risk loans. But they didn't think about the long-term consequences. They were too focused on the short-term profits. And as these subprime borrowers failed to make payments, the homes they had bought went into foreclosure. The loans couldn't be repaid, and the real estate market began to collapse. It wasn't just home buyers who were affected. These high-risk loans began to pile up, and the banks were left holding the bag. But it didn't end there. To make the situation even worse, banks started securitizing these bad loans. What does that mean? Banks were packaging these risky loans that nobody could repay, into mortgage-backed securities. These were then sold to investors, including other banks, pension funds, and foreign governments, who believed they were investing in safe, reliable assets. Banks were telling investors these securities were a safe bet. They claimed that the market would continue to rise and that the value of homes would never decrease. In reality, these loans were just ticking time bombs waiting to explode. And when the housing bubble popped, the securities became worthless, sending shockwaves throughout the entire financial system. These toxic assets were flooding the market, but no one knew just how dangerous they were until it was too late. Everyone from small investors to the largest financial institutions was caught in the crossfire. And there's another major factor in this disaster: credit rating agencies. Agencies like Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch were supposed to provide an independent assessment of risk. But instead, they gave these toxic mortgage-backed securities high ratings, claiming they were low-risk investments. They didn't warn anyone about the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Why? Because the credit rating agencies were paid by the very banks that were packaging and selling these securities. This created a massive conflict of interest. These agencies were incentivized to give high ratings to these products so that banks could continue selling them to investors. The result? A huge misrepresentation of risk, which made the entire market feel more stable than it actually was. The credit rating agencies failed to recognize the dangers, and as a result, they helped create the perfect storm that led to the collapse of the global economy. When the housing bubble burst, it triggered a chain reaction that caused a global financial collapse. Banks failed, mortgages were defaulted on, and millions of homes were foreclosed. The economy went into a tailspin, with businesses collapsing, employees losing jobs, and families losing homes. But the real tragedy was that everyday people were the ones who bore the brunt of the crisis. Big banks like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns went bankrupt. In the United States, the financial sector was left in disarray. Governments around the world had to step in with bailouts to prevent the entire global financial system from collapsing. And here's the most frustrating part. Corporate executives and regulators who were responsible for the collapse were able to avoid any real consequences. Despite their role in causing the crisis, many of the executives received golden parachutes, hefty severance packages, and were never held accountable for their part in the systemic failure. In contrast, millions of Americans, Europeans, and global citizens lost their homes, their savings, and their livelihoods. The economic devastation was felt across the world, with unemployment reaching record levels. People who had trusted the system found themselves completely betrayed by the same institutions they thought were protecting their interests. While the banks were bailed out, the people who were most affected, the families, the workers, the small investors, were left to pick up the pieces. But the story doesn't end there. The financial crisis didn't just expose bad loans and mismanagement. It showed the dangerous and systemic flaws in the entire financial system. The banks were too big to fail. The system was too complex to fix. And as a result, the billion-dollar bonuses kept flowing, while the people who were left to pick up the pieces were left with nothing. How could this happen in the modern world? How could the system fail so spectacularly, with so many people involved, and yet nobody was held truly accountable? The answers are complex, but the aftermath is clear. The collapse changed the global economy forever. So why do these corporate scandals continue to happen, despite the overwhelming consequences? The answer, unfortunately, is simple: money. At the heart of every scandal is the desire for instant wealth and unlimited profits. This thirst for financial gain drives corporations to cut corners, deceive investors, and manipulate systems in order to increase profits and maintain a facade of success. But why does this behavior persist? Why do companies keep engaging in fraudulent activity even when they know the risks of getting caught are enormous? It's because the incentives are too powerful to ignore. For executives, the pressure to deliver quarterly profits and achieve record stock prices can lead them down a dangerous path. When the temptation of quick financial gain outweighs the risk of getting caught, it becomes easy to rationalize unethical behavior. In fact, some executives don't even believe they'll ever be caught. They think that their company is too big, too important, or too influential to be held accountable. And in many cases, they're right. The corporate world operates on the principle that money and influence can shield a company from serious consequences. That's why we continue to see the same pattern of behavior in major scandals. It's the incentive to cheat and manipulate that drives the whole machine forward. But there's more to it than just greed. Many of these corporate scandals happen because certain industries are underregulated, meaning companies can operate with little to no oversight. When regulation is weak or doesn't exist, businesses are able to act with impunity, knowing that their actions won't be questioned or punished. The more money a corporation has, the more power it gains. With power comes influence. And with influence, corporations can easily circumvent regulations and avoid accountability. This is a vicious cycle. Companies grow bigger, gain more power, and find new ways to manipulate systems to protect their interests. And by the time regulators catch up, the damage has already been done, and the corporation has already moved on to the next profit-driven scheme. For instance, in the case of the 2008 financial crisis, major banks and mortgage lenders were able to create and sell risky mortgage-backed securities because there were few regulations governing the industry at the time. The lack of oversight allowed these institutions to make huge profits while risking the entire economy. Similarly, Volkswagen's fraudulent emissions tests were only able to go unnoticed for so long because of the lack of stringent environmental regulations. When companies have the ability to control their regulatory environment, it becomes much easier for them to avoid the consequences of their actions. And that's where the dark economy comes into play. The system is rigged to favor the corporations, not the people. The too big to fail mentality is a dangerous mindset that many large corporations and financial institutions live by. It suggests that certain companies are so important to the economy that their failure would cause too much damage. The result? These companies get bailed out whenever they run into trouble, protecting them from the consequences of their actions. But what happens when these companies are bailed out? They continue to engage in the same unethical behaviors that caused their downfall in the first place. In the case of the 2008 financial crisis, the government stepped in to provide massive bailouts to failing banks and auto manufacturers. But this bailout didn't solve the root causes of corporate fraud or address the systemic problems that allowed these companies to operate recklessly in the first place. Instead of punishing the executives responsible for the fraud, the bailout simply allowed these companies to continue operating without facing the consequences of their actions. The real victims were the everyday people who were left to pay the price. Taxpayers who funded the bailout, of homeowners who lost their homes, and workers who lost their jobs. In essence, the too big to fail mentality is a way of rewarding failure and ignoring the economic realities that affect millions of people. And when the government uses taxpayer money to bail out these companies, it sends a dangerous message. Corporate greed is acceptable, and the public will always foot the bill. As we look at the systemic failure in the corporate world, it becomes clear that the incentives are all wrong. Greed and power outweigh the need for transparency and accountability. So how do we stop this cycle of corporate corruption? How do we hold corporations accountable when they have so much power and influence? Stay tuned, because in the next section, we'll explore the long-term consequences of this dark economy and how we can start to break free from its grip. After hearing about some of the most massive corporate scandals in history, Enron, Volkswagen, and the 2008 financial crisis, what can we learn from all this? How can we prevent ourselves from falling victim to the same deceitful practices that have ruined so many lives? First and foremost, if an investment sounds too good to be true, it probably is. We've all heard the stories of people who turned small investments into huge fortunes, but the reality is that the most successful investments require hard work, research, and due diligence. If someone is promising you quick returns or making it sound easy, beware. There's no such thing as a get-rich-quick scheme that's legitimate. Second, it's absolutely crucial that you research the companies you choose to invest in. Don't just take their word for it or trust what you hear on the news. Investigate the company's financial history, read its annual reports, and check the credibility of the management team. Don't rely on flashy advertisements or glowing testimonials that promise you easy wealth. These are often red flags designed to pull you in and make you feel comfortable with a decision that could cost you everything. But learning from these scandals goes beyond just being cautious with your own money. We need systemic changes to prevent these kinds of frauds from happening in the future. And that starts with more regulation, transparency, and accountability in the corporate world. One of the biggest problems with corporate fraud is that too many companies operate with little to no oversight. In many cases, they are able to bend the rules and manipulate systems because the regulations governing them are weak or outdated. This needs to change. We need stronger laws that require companies to be transparent in their financial reporting and more oversight to ensure they're following ethical business practices. We also need to hold companies accountable for their actions. Too often, the executives behind these massive corporate scandals walk away with fat bonuses, while the employees and everyday people who are affected by their actions are left with nothing. There's no real consequence for the individuals who are responsible for the damage. We need to demand accountability, not just through fines and settlements, but by putting people in positions of power who are genuinely committed to enforcing ethical practices and transparency. If we want to avoid future corporate scandals, we need to educate ourselves and take action. Financial literacy is one of the best ways to protect yourself from falling victim to these schemes. Knowing how companies work, understanding financial statements, and recognizing red flags can help you avoid scams and make better investment decisions. Additionally, it's important to question the status quo. If a company seems to be getting away with unethical practices, it's our job to demand change. As consumers and investors, we hold a tremendous amount of power. When we speak up, when we hold companies to a higher standard, we can force them to act with integrity and take accountability for their actions. One of the main reasons these scandals continue is that companies have become so entrenched in their power that they feel untouchable. But if we make it clear that we won't tolerate fraud and deception, we can force a change in the system. Accountability and transparency must be the foundation of every business, and we have the power to demand that. So, what do we do now? Can we stop the cycle of corporate greed and deception, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again? The reality is that change won't come easily, but it must come if we want to avoid the same fate as the countless victims of these corporate scandals. As we wrap up, let's reflect on the key takeaways. The importance of research, the need for stronger regulations, and the power of individual action in demanding a more ethical corporate world. Stay tuned as we continue exploring how you can protect yourself from future scams in the coming sections. As we look back at the stories of corporate fraud, it's clear that these scandals are not isolated incidents. They are the result of systemic issues in the way we do business. The temptation of easy profits and the dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a few people create an environment ripe for fraud. These are the root causes behind every corporate scandal we've discussed. These scandals weren't just the result of a few bad apples. They are part of a much larger, broken system that prioritizes profit over ethics, power over accountability, and greed over responsibility. Until we recognize and address these systemic problems, we will continue to see these types of frauds and deceitful practices infiltrate our businesses, our economies, and our lives. The lessons from these corporate disasters are not just about what happened in the past. They're a warning for what could happen in the future if we don't make real changes in how companies operate, how they are held accountable, and how we protect ourselves as consumers and investors. If this video opened your eyes to the hidden dangers of corporate corruption and fraud, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the world of business deceit and how to protect yourself from falling victim to similar schemes. We all have a role to play in demanding accountability and transparency in the corporate world. So don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and together we can make the business world a little bit more honest.